Last week on this program, I asked some questions when the program began about 1981, when Ronald Reagan and the team moved into the White House. How will we remember 1980, and who will stop assassinations and murders and genocide and torture? And I had a long list of questions that are on a printed sheet that you can send for if you don't have it. People that subscribe to the tapes get it with the tapes. I also said the assassination teams from the early 60s are all in place, and the murderers are moving up in power as Ronald Reagan takes over in the Senate in California and the Senate and the House and committees in Washington, D.C. Strom Thurmond, the member of the Senate who wanted the Lennons deported in the 70s, early 70s, on the most flimsy charges, is now head of the Judiciary Committee. Well, Sunday night I posed some questions for the end of this year and trouble spots in the world and listed them. And 24 hours later, John Lennon was dead. And within 2 days, that body of flesh, whatever it is, was cremated and delivered to Yoko Ono in a jar. And what remains is what we remember and what we do with it. The flesh is gone, but the memories, of course, live on. Our family were fortunate, I suppose, of all the people listening tonight who take the tapes. Maybe we were one of the few that had the opportunity to meet the Lennons. We spent the day with John and Yoko Lennon in San Francisco at the Stanford court. My first article, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped?, about Watergate, had just come out that week, and they called immediately to Carmel and invited us to spend the day with them. We were Beatle fans from the time he first came with the others did Sullivan's program, and we took our children to Candlestick Park for their we didn't know it'd be their last concert, but we took them October 29th in 1966, and they left and went to Great Britain, and that was the last time the group was seen together. We also took all our children, we had 7 seats for every concert at the Monterey Pop, summer of '69, and they saw and heard people like Janis Joplin and Otis Redding and Jimi Hendrix and Mama Cass, the Mamas and Papas, and others. And the music scene has been very much a part of our family life through all of these turbulent years. We enjoyed the music. We learned from it. It freed us from a lot of things. And I have a lot of emotions, of course, about the Lennons and what happened this week that neatly ties up this era. At one time, they considered renting our home in Carmel, California. Yoko's husband, Mr. Cox, had kidnapped her daughter, and she was supposed to be, they believed, at Wood School in Carmel. She was seen at Carmel Beach, and they sent a friend of theirs who was with them when we visited down here to look at the house to see if they could use our home and live here and see if they could locate her daughter. But at the end of the summer, the trail grew cold and they weren't here any longer, so there was no reason for them to move to Carmel. My first issue of The Realist that introduced me to the Lennons, or the Lennons to us, had a cartoon that Paul Krasner had in there, Rose America's Baby, and it was a takeoff of the American situation, the political situation at the time in the summer of 1972, and it's ironic to know that Rosemary's Baby was actually filmed at the Dakota Apartments where the Lennons live. There are all kinds of ironies and situations that come to mind at a time like this. When I heard John Lennon was shot, I had to deal with it this week in 4 different compartments of my mind. One, what the Beatles did for me personally, for May Brussell, with 5 children, ages 1.5 to 14, and the freedom that their lifestyle gave to me personally and helped me grow. I wasn't a teenager. I wasn't a runaway from home. I was a married woman with 5 children, but deeply moved by 3 influences in my life. One, Virginia Woolf, the other, Henry Miller, and the other, the Beatles, and the rock music scene, along with the Beatles. Then I thought of the relationship of the Lennons and having the opportunity to meet them and know them personally. And then I had to deal with my anger at them for taking 5 years off to find themselves, to accumulate extreme wealth, to pull out, to take care of the baby, to find that inner self, because there wasn't 5 minutes or 5 hours or 5 days that I thought there was a luxury of doing that introspection. I did that kind of thing when the family was asleep, right through with my work, or taking a hot bubble bath at night, or going down to Big Sur, or camping, or whatever. The road that we're going into World War III, the inevitable atomic war that this government is building up for, was so apparent, and the murders were so apparent of people who spoke up for peace, that it was really a luxury to take this time out. And while he was close to his child, the 5 years trying to find himself, and then comes forward and says, yeah, I'm emerging. I spent 5 years with my child. I had 5 children and had to deal with the politics of the time, and my children also as a researcher, as a writer, doing the radio shows, reading, studying, and still dealing with a family. And then, of course, you have to deal with the news media and the blatant lies they publish right after these kinds of murders. And while I'm not going into the evidence of the assassination this week, there's enough to tell you right now how the media is covering it, and we'll go more into this David Mark Chapman later this evening and in the next couple of weeks. But we have to deal with the news media, the brainwashing, the lone nut, the single coup, the easy story that people want to accept. Yoko Ono wrote a poem in 1963, in the autumn of 63. She doesn't date it, whether it began before John Kennedy was killed or after, but it's called Collecting Peace. And this is what she wrote. Collect sounds in your mind that you have overheard through the week. Repeat them in your mind in different orders one afternoon. And thinking of that poem, and we have her collected poetry, I began to think of things that I had heard during the week that came to my mind. John Lennon, Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, Otis Redding, Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Duane Allman, Mama Cass Elliot, Graham Parsons, Mark Bolan, Keith Moon, Paul Kossoff, Jim Reeves, Barry Oakley, Tim Buckley, Jim Croce, Richard Farina, Donald Rex Jackson, the manager for the Grateful Dead, Michael Jeffrey, the manager of Jimi Hendrix, Brian Epstein, the manager of the Beatles, Vinnie Taylor of the Sha-Na-Na on the eve of a big concert they were going to, Paul Williams, choreographer for the Temptations, Pamela Morrison, the wife of Jim Morrison, Rod McKiernan, Pigpen, known as Pigpen of the Grateful Dead, Phil Oakes, Sal Mineo, Meredith Hunter, and the ritual killing at Altamont Festival. I wrote a chapter for an article called Helter Skelter, Give Me Shelter, from the Beatles till Altamont. That was the concert where Melvin Belli, Jack Ruby's attorney, who I mentioned often on this program, the attorney for Mussolini and Mrs. Hermann Goering, hired the Hells Angels, who did the ritual killing of Meredith Hunter before a camera, to show the world that the peace lovers had a violent festival. It was really the end of the authentic rock festival. Steve Parson, lead singer of the Children, Jimmy Reed, Ricky Valens, J.P. Richardson of the Big Border, Rennie Van Zant and Steve Gaines of the Leonard Skinner Group, Sid Vicious from the Sex Pistols, who was singing anti-Nazi songs, John Bonham of the Led Zeppelin, Nearly Dead, the third mysterious man when Richard Pryor caught fire, Bob Dylan's near-fatal crash on a motorcycle. He survived. It wasn't like Richard Farina, who didn't survive, who died in Carmel Valley. Stevie Wonder almost died. Eric Clapton, the Dave Mason Band, and the Weavers were nearly dead. The FBI had documented plans to destroy their group. And along with them, the original murderer, Lenny Bruce, and others, Bonnie Morney, Larry Williams, and Bon Scott, the lead singer of AC/DC, the Australian rock group. I'm not talking about politicians, I'm talking about musicians. Some plane crashes, some automobile crashes, some allegedly overdoses, most of them on the eve of new big successes, bigger records, every reason to live, many of them anti-establishment. Janis making fun of Port Arthur, Texas, and Jimi Hendrix screwing the guitar and telling the establishment to stick it and shove it. There were all kinds of ways to die. There's ways to skin a cat. But John Lennon was the cruel, similar to John Kennedy, on the street, not overdosed like Elvis Presley. His doctor was almost charged with murder, but gunned down like a dog as he was ready to emerge from his own private life. And this broadcast also is for Bonnie Brussell, 14 years old. This is the first radio program of mine on Sunday night since John Lennon was murdered, and it's the 10th anniversary of my own daughter's murder, along with many children and siblings of researchers and writers and politicians. We paid our dues many times over. So, Yoko, we know what sorrow is. The dog that I got information about who arranged that accident here on the Monterey Peninsula is now under indictment for the wrong reasons, an ab scam, but he'll get off because he's one of the biggest fixers of the mob and all the other murders and fits right into this picture. So I know from brutal experience that these things stay a long time and they recur, and they'll recur until we decide that we've had enough. I don't know when your bottom line is who you have to see killed until you say, I'm ready to fight back. But at some time you're going to have to decide who it is that's going to be off, that you're going to stand up and get mad about. Mort Saul wrote in his book Heartland about my expose of various murders, and he wrote how many have to die before some Americans realize that murder is not a way of life. Too many have lost America because they brought her their lust but could never love her. And then he criticized Hugh Hefner, who attacked Mae Brussell, he said, who is an assassination researcher who pursues these murders selflessly. And he asks the question, when are we going to stop this? Mort said, I started the battle early. That's when he started investigating the murder of John Kennedy. The enemy isn't political in nature, it's insanity, which I combated through my purpose. And he tells how hard it was for America to understand what is happening. Mort Saul asked a few years ago in that book, is it too late for America? How many lies before you belong to the lies? You can't return to your own lines. They don't recognize you. You are made different by the company you keep. Nixon reminds you of what you have become. That was written several years ago. Life is a series of woven threads, and you put them together, and pieces fit together, and patterns and designs, and you get impressions of these fabrics depending on the colors and hues and the way they weave and the lives that weave in and out. But social change, people like John Lennon and the Beatles, or those others that I mentioned and listed that have died young at the prime of their career making change, social change is difficult. It's hard to do. Breaking those chains, knowing each other, loving each other, sharing each other, sending the message that peace is possible, that war is wrong, is difficult to get into people's minds. They associate you with the enemy when you don't want to fight or kill other people. What's wrong with you? Are you queer? Are you a coward? Are you a communist? They don't see that the only way to survive and enjoy anything in this world is through peace. And people who want to make change are gunned down, and brutally it came to all of us this week. Carl Sandburg wrote a poem that is one of my favorites, Advice of a Father to a Son Nearing Manhood. And he said, life is hard, be steel, be a rock. And that's true. And then he said, life is a soft loam, be gentle and go easy, because brutes have been gentled where lashes failed. And he referred to the way frail flowers come and shatter split rock. I think of that often when I drive down Highway 1 or up on the hill where I live and I see these poppies coming out of nowhere, out of rock, and you know that it works. And he advised in his poem to sons to take time off and be alone often and get to know yourself, which was what Lennon was doing the last 5 years. And don't tell white lies and keep protective fronts. Tell him solitude is creative if he is strong, and the final decisions are made in silent rooms. Be different from other people. And this was what Lennon was saying. If it comes natural and easy, being different, Carl Sandburg had advised. Let him have lazy days seeking his deeper motives, and let him seek deep from where he was born so that he may understand Shakespeare and the Wright brothers and Pasteur, and free imaginations bringing into a world that resents change. And John Lennon exemplified that kind of a challenge to the world. The Beatles, all of them, I don't want to single him out, but he is the one who was killed, and he is the one that took this kind of advice and went off by himself and came out optimistic and was emerging with a young son and a wife and recording, and was gunned down in New York. I wrote an article for a national magazine several years ago. They wanted on the killing of the rock musicians. The government documents that they were being harassed and suppressed. And then the top boss of the magazine killed the story. They paid me for it, and I kept the rights. And maybe I'll rewrite it now with John Lennon's name to the list. But the managing editor of the magazine called me this week about a possible story on the murder of John Lennon. So I sent them another resume of what I would put into the article, and this is what I put as my resume. These are the subjects that I would include. It would be a one-page resume of what I would do if they want to do it this time. The assassin, Mark David Chapman, was a tool identical to other political zombie murderers. Détente and peace are lethal words in a society that has been determined since 1919 to make war against the Soviet Union. Rock music and musicians were becoming the largest social, cultural, and political force for world peace. This energy, talent, and enthusiasm was spreading around the world. Operation Chaos and other federal government programs were formed to disrupt, reject, and eliminate the combined skills of too many. They did a good job. Their project has worked until now because of inaction and apathy of both the victim's family and their fans, and the crimes are concealed by the mass media. Lennon's murder today is being compared to John Kennedy's. The war in Southeast Asia escalated November 24th, 1963, with no known provocation. It was planned in advance for that date. At the time that John Lennon was murdered, November 9th, 1980, the United States is on the brink of war in Poland and the Middle East. My goals for this article would be 4 things. 1, the motive, the reasons for killing John Lennon, and I listed 4 motives: his anti-war capability of gathering us together again, his capability to do it one more time, his anti-establishment attitude, his anti-Christ statements he made years ago, and his anti-macho perspective of life. As against the Clint Eastwoods and the John Waynes, he was a man who could tender and take care of a child and get him prepared for life in the home, in the milieu of loving parents, bake his bread, write his songs, make love, and be creative, and work for peace. And it's those things that the establishment can't tolerate. The motive, as I say, for killing him was the anti-Christ, his position on religion, anti-war, anti-establishment, and anti-macho. Secondly, I would compare Mark David Chapman to the other political killers, the smirk, the loner, the mysterious wife, the unemployed with money, who travels around continents to Beirut, Lebanon, Switzerland, London, Southeast Asia, the Jesus freak, the good boy, the anti-Lennon politics. Thirdly, I would give documented proof that government agencies dislike the entire music culture, the rock musicians, the anti-war, anti-establishment gatherings, and document the historical pattern set in Germany from 1922 to 1933 of similar murders systematically done to silence opponents of World War II, and then list the other artists that were wiped out. That is the resume I sent to them. If they want it this time, I'll write it for them. If not, I may just sit down and put it into one book. Mark David Chapman traveled all over the world, as I say, London, Switzerland, Southeast Asia. He was in New York in October. He's back again in November. He traveled with weapons. He's a mystery person. And similar to all the other political assassinations, to give you an example of the kind of similarity that runs through, all the other people that were picked up as suspects or the alleged assassins, such as Lee Harvey Oswald, James Earl Ray, Sirhan, all had doubles, multi-names, aliases, a lot of money, traveled other continents, allegedly were loners, had a lot of friends, but we're told that they did this one act alone out of some anger or particular frustration. In this case, they're trying to say that he thought he was the Beatle and identified and killed the bad part of him. There was a picture taken of John Lennon signing a record album with Mark David Chapman, and when Lennon was killed, the photographer called the New York police, and they refused to accept the picture. They didn't want it. They said, don't bother. Then his wife was told, according to the Los Angeles Times, on the telephone, don't release any other pictures of Chapman. Then in Miami, in Dade County, they had a mix-up on a computer, and he used to live in Miami. And the New York court said that erroneously he had a criminal record, and the computer picked up the name of the fugitive, the last name, the date of birth, the race, the height of the slaying suspect, and it seems that there was another person down in Florida that fit all of this. So there was a mix-up in the courts. So there probably, obviously, was another Mark David Chapman. And when he was arrested, I saw something on television which I haven't seen since the stories when Lee Harvey Oswald was taken out of the theater in Dallas, Texas. They threw a coat over the Mark David Chapman that went into the jail, and you didn't see the face of the person. So the police department at first didn't want any photographs. They notified the wife, don't give pictures, and they protected his face. Now, you've read recently in the newspaper about the missing Oswald. Marina Oswald is 99% sure that the person in the grave isn't Lee Harvey Oswald. Next week, we'll go more into the physical evidence, the subterfuge, the use of doubles. But this is the same kind of hanky-panky. I'm giving you one example tonight, and I don't want to dwell too much on it this evening, of the subterfuge in the Lennon case. Why tell Mrs. Chapman not to release these pictures? Maybe they weren't going to bring this one in. Maybe they had another zombie who would take the rap and be killed. If somebody hadn't taken that picture in front of the Dakota apartments and gave it to the New York Daily News or newspaper there, why did the police refuse to accept the picture? Why did they come out with a computer readout of identical information from Florida and then have to backtrack and apologize in the courts about a past record? This Mark David Chapman did live in Florida, and Oswald had doubles in Florida that I'm working on a book. He had doubles down there, and they were withholding pictures. They covered his head. When Lee Harvey Oswald was taken from the theater when he was arrested after John Kennedy was killed in Dallas, Texas in November 1963, he said, in quotes, "Why should I hide my face? I haven't done anything to be ashamed of." And a coat was thrown over his face. And later it did turn out that there were 3 other Lee Harvey Oswalds with identical faces. So we still don't know who was in the theater because there is no photographic record of this person leaving the theater. Well, that's the way the coat was thrown over this Chapman's face. They had a description, exactly, a computer readout in Florida. He lived in Florida. The police didn't want the photograph on site. Now, you would think that the New York police squad, if they weren't in on part of the subterfuge, would accept any pictures because maybe there were other people in the background with him or somebody that drove him there. But it's this kind of subterfuge that runs through the assassination of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, the shooting of George Wallace, and the mysteries of Chappaquiddick. The political assassinations have a pattern that never fails. It comes through at times like this, and that's one reason that I'm comparing the shooting of John Lennon to the shooting of John Kennedy, because there are these similarities that don't wash away, and they involve the FBI computer readouts or the police department, and the subterfuge that those people investigating it should be working on, but they cover up for whatever reason, and the reason involves the assassins themselves, the people that send this guy halfway around the world, all the way around the world and back, and he ends up at the Dakota Apartments. It's 30 minutes now. For those that have the cassettes, we'll turn those over. I'll take a break. It's Mae Brussell. We'll be back in 1 minute.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International with
when we were with the Lennons in 1972 and they had my realist article, a section of that article had to do with American assassins as mutations, as a creation of our espionage establishment being subject to mind control, and the role of the news media in perpetuating the lies about these assassins. And part of that article had to do with the story, the lie about Lee Harvey Oswald being, in quotes, the lone assassin. And I said our American assassins hired as decoys are either killed or isolated in their cages. The lone assassin becomes an animal to be dissected by Pentagon social scientists and psychiatrists, and then the media, the puppet media, and other experts pick up the lingo and pass along disinformation as facts. And while this human being is turned into a patsy, monitored every second and isolated until his death, covert agents manufacture what are supposed to have been his motives for becoming the assassin. The fictitious personality should be studied and is supposed to be the model of future assassins. And I mentioned then that Sirhan, Charles Manson, John Frazier, and others, if they were free to talk, would shake American justice and conspiratorial processes to their very roots. And I went on the domino theory that if you say that Lee Harvey Oswald was a loner or a misfit or rejected or unknown or wanted a place in history, then you could carry this same story on to the killing of Robert Kennedy or Martin Luther King or the murder at Chappaquiddick or the shooting of George Wallace in Maryland. And I mentioned that the physical evidence to solve these crimes is put aside, criminology is put aside, and out comes the profile of the assassination that is a total diversion from the facts. And in the next few weeks, I'm going to outline ways that we can go into who killed John Lennon. One of the chances or flukes of history is that David Mark Chapman had offices across the street from the Scientologists in Hawaii. The Scientologists are the most fervent investigators. They made the original connections of J. Edgar Hoover to Interpol, to the Nazis, and have published many articles on mind control. And if this David Mark Chapman was at a mental hospital in Hawaii where Edmund Kemper and various other California assassins were sent and turned into killers, they will know it. They will trace him out. And while the death of John Lennon has only been less than 1 week, be sure that the Scientologists who knew this character on the island will go to every length they can to find out who paid his way to Lebanon, who paid his way to Southeast Asia, what organization he worked for, how he got to Switzerland, how he got in the army camp in Arkansas with the Vietnamese. And they'll trace him, but they're right in Hawaii, and they knew him. And as a fluke of history, it may be that they will help put in the missing pieces of this terrible murder. The Los Angeles Times and all the major newspapers run disgusting stories after these assassinations. And also in the next few weeks, I'll read you the headlines of some of the other political assassinations and then update you what was really true, what the real truth was, and how the media is used to brainwash everybody and put them to sleep and at rest, that there is no violence per se in this country. These are just loners. out wanting to identify with their victims. The Los Angeles Times had a story, John Lennon's death didn't fit the pattern. They go into Elvis Presley, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, Keith Moon, John Bonham. But Robert Hilburn, who said Lennon's death did not fit the pattern. What was the pattern? Overdose of drugs, car accidents, plane crashes. What was the pattern? It may not have fit the pattern of Lenny Bruce being overdosed because he was very political, talking about the Kennedy assassination, or Dr. Kruger, the hypnotist, giving Freddie Prinze his gun and being with him, telling him to go home when he's allegedly depressed, handing him the gun, and Freddie Prinze is home playing the Zapruder films of the killing of John Kennedy and about to go to Florida to find out who killed Kennedy. It didn't fit the pattern of Otis Redding or Jim Croce and the Leonard Skinner, the plane crashes, or Buddy Holly, but it fit a pattern. And the Los Angeles Times doesn't go into that. John Lennon's murder fit a pattern of Abraham Lincoln, who was against slavery, or Mahatma Gandhi, who was against material possessions that Lennon sings about in Imagine, and chasing imperialism out of India and escorting the British to the edge of the water and telling him to scram. It fit the pattern of John Kennedy gunned down in Dealey Plaza. It certainly fit the pattern of Malcolm X gunned down in New York City with the Red Squad and Tony Laswitz and all the Watergate White House team behind that murder. It fit the Martin Luther King assassination on the balcony, gunned down in cold blood, or the Robert Kennedy murder in the Ambassador Hotel, or Representative Leo Ryan's murder down in Jonestown. Each one of these people was trying to make the world safer against slavery, against colonialism, for civil rights, against the nuclear test ban treaty, against organized crime, for prison reform. Every one of these was a social activist, and you certainly have to know, if you've played Lennon songs or known John Lennon, particularly even after the Beatles group broke up, the social activism and the concern, and the Beatles themselves breaking all the establishment rules. John Lennon's anti-establishment attitude. He did all the wrong things and succeeded. In this country, you're supposed to go to Groton, you're supposed to go to Harvard and Yale and Princeton and wear pointy black shoes with 3-button or 2-button coats and look and talk a certain way and get on Meet the Press and talk about indexes and price indexes and talk about the country in terms that nobody understands. The Los Angeles Times, for once, rock wasn't to blame. John Lennon's death didn't fit the pattern. I repeat, it fit the pattern perfectly for what he believed in, and that's why people are so sad this week and meeting all over the world and in genuine grief, the same grief they felt when John Kennedy was murdered. They didn't cry for the flesh they lost. They cried for the world they face without them. They realized they had a friend, and the friend is gone, and we sit back and expect political leaders to do it for us, to do things for us. The leaders can't do it alone, and certainly when they're up front, they're gunned down. So while he didn't fit the pattern of the rock music, he fit the pattern of people who wanted change in the world, as I listed them to you, and that's just a few names. There's many, many more. Doug Hammarskjöld and Adlai Stevenson, and there were plane crashes and people falling out of windows. But I'm talking about men that were gunned down in public in front of the people that loved them and came to admire them. And his murder fit that pattern. Next week, I'm not going into the details now. I'm going to do a resume of another article. It's from the Chicago Tribune this week. It's another BS newsprint cover-up story. The Four Faces of Lennon's Killer, a bizarre psychiatric portrait. Well, where did James Younger come across it within 6 days? How does he know about the tormented brain of Mark David Chapman? I've seen this crap for so long, I want to puke. But even he has to ask questions when he doesn't have the answers, and it's the questions he asks that will give us the clue to find out what went behind this murder. One interesting thing, he says that Mark David Chapman was itching to wander, so he got a job as a YMCA student working in Beirut, Lebanon. The man that wrote The Exorcist, his name was Blakey or Blady. I was looking for that book tonight. I couldn't find it on my shelf. He was from the United States military, head of military intelligence, and worked in Beirut, Lebanon, and the CIA had a mind control center there. So itching to wander at age 20 doesn't explain what Mark David Chapman was doing, but I would venture to say that after he left Fort Worth and after he went to Florida and then went to Georgia and Tennessee, I would venture to say that his real initiation into mind control began in Beirut, Lebanon. I'm saying that this is only 6 days since John Lennon was murdered, but I'll give you a little clue where to look for the mind control. That's where the personality began to change of this man who they said identified with Lennon but worked strictly with the Jesus freaks, the people that were against the Beatles, against the Lennons, that resented the remarks John Lennon had made. I was upset about the Lennon shooting on Tuesday morning. I came into KLRB just to walk around and mainly to get out of the house because the phone had been ringing since 11 o'clock at night. And by 3 in the morning, I fell asleep and it started, and I came into KLRB. And one of the people that works here that I've known over the years right away said to me, "You know it was one lone person." Well, I would accept the fact that one lone person killed John Lennon after I investigate the facts. But there's something I don't understand, and that is how people can solve a crime in 12 hours. They must know a lot more than I know, but they don't have the library I have. I have many, many books on Operation Mind Control, the CIA involvement in mind control, the CIA telling people to kill themselves, the control of Candy Jones, how she came to California and took on 2 personalities, how she was told to murder herself in Paradise Island. They say this boy shot John Lennon because he was suicidal. The CIA trains you to be suicidal. You can be perfectly normal until they get their hands on you, and then they teach you how to be suicidal. You don't shoot John Lennon because you're suicidal, and you don't travel across continents, go to New York and staying at $81 room hotels and back to Hawaii and back to New York. And the thing that I really get upset about, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to do my work no matter what, and there's some people that know what's going on in the world, and there's some that never will. But it just really blows my mind that 13 hours after somebody as irreverent, anti-establishment, anti-war as John Lennon was, can be gunned down, and the willingness of people to accept the fact that the case is solved in 12 hours. It happens over and over again. I don't understand it. At least study how this fellow got to London, how he got to Southeast Asia, what he was doing in Hawaii. Even this great Chicago Tribune article doesn't explain. They said they don't know how he got to Hawaii. Who met him there? What was his wife doing there? Is she an agent? All these questions beg to be answered over and over and over again. And it isn't simple. There are not simple answers. And the fact that the world is grieving for John Lennon so badly means that he touched us. And if he touched us that badly, who else was he touching? Whose shoes was he stepping on? Because not everyone sees the world as you see it, or maybe Brussels sees it. A lot of people see it a different way. I saw Today's Show this week, and a man wrote a book on atomic warfare. Tom Brokaw was interviewing him, and he explained that atomic warfare is going to be a fact in the Reagan administration, and that it doesn't matter if North America is wiped out because South America will continue to exist without the radiation. And then Tom Brokaw says, well, that isn't very nice, and suggests now we'll turn back to Jane Pauley, and today we're going to review Popeye, and the woman who plays the part of Olive Oil is on. Cut to the next segment of the news. Wouldn't you just jump out of your chair if you were Tom Brokaw and say, North America isn't going to survive? I mean, you telling me it's not important? Adolf Hitler said in his books, let's take all of South America or Africa and Middle East because North America is run by the Jews and liberals and they don't count. And years later, here's a man writing about atomic warfare, and we're on the brink of atomic warfare. The morning after John Lennon is murdered, this dog is talking about the North American continent accepting the fact of radiation and being a plausible thing. When the elections were going on and the debates were going on, Jimmy Carter said, and implied Reagan would get us into a war. And Reagan said, I'm highly incensed. This is the most terrible thing you've ever said. And here is a man in the Reagan camp outright saying it up front as if it's a fait accompli. Would John Lennon have stood for that? Would he have allowed his silence after those 5 years of tending a little boy, a child, and an 18-year-old, 17-year-old son? What forces would get together to stop World War III? It wasn't just what John Lennon or the Beatles did that was a threat to this government going into these treacherous times. It's their potential that had to be wiped out. It isn't just what they said about peace and love and brotherhood in the past. It's all there. That's all there for us, and people all over the world have mourned and will continue to mourn. The point was that he was emerging, and we don't know what he would do. Maybe he'd continue buying 4 limousines, maybe 8. Maybe he has the Vanderbilt estate in Florida. Maybe he'd buy the Whitney. Maybe he wants all their estates and castles. Maybe he wouldn't do anything. Maybe they continue to collect fur coats. I don't know what they would do. But if there was a war and he didn't want his boy to be bombed out or his family or the human race bombed out, all they'd have to do, the 4 Beatles, is get on the phone and have a concert, and people's awareness would be put together. So the gangland slaying of this man was to wipe out his potential, and that's important. And as Carl Sandburg said, learn in silence and learn facts. And as he was emerging, he spent 5 years, and Lennon, learned a lot in those 5 years. The Bible is an interesting book, and when you read the beginning of it, you learn about the Garden of Eden. And don't forget the forbidden fruit. I mentioned this many times on broadcast. The forbidden fruit was not nudity or screwing around. It was knowledge. Be careful of knowledge, because knowledge will kill you. And in these terrible times, the smart ones get off because they're the ones that have put it together. So that the tree of the Garden of Eden was knowing the difference between good and evil. The tree, the knowledge of good of evil, thou shalt not eat it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. I wonder sometimes if this wasn't written to keep people from thinking, to whoever wrote these sayings in the Bible, to keep you under their control. This was a form of mind control of its own, to make you fearful to learn. Because once you learn, you can do things for yourself. You have life pretty much under control. That's one of the things the Beatles and the 60s taught me. I had a large home, a lot of help, as I say, a big family, and depended on a lot of people for ideas, although I was learning all the time. And after Kennedy was killed, I began to figure out things myself. I read contradictions in what the newspapers said as against what the Warren Commission hearings published under sworn testimony of witnesses. I began to learn I didn't have to dress a certain way. You didn't have to get out certain kinds of shoes in the winter and put them away in the spring. Your spectator pumps, your white shoes, your matching purses, red purse with red shoes with blue purse. I got rid of all the things I didn't need in the 60s, and I was very moved by the 60s. Even though I was 40 at the time, I got rid of the high heels and the girdles and the stocking and the jewelry and the beauty parlors and all the accoutrements and all the junk, and began to make my own things or my own gifts and my own entertaining in my own way, and realize that there were layers of lies that they put on you. It sells good, it's great, Madison Avenue, but you don't have to keep buying hose that run and all that. crap and coats that match and accessories that match. It was a period when the Beatles came with their clothes and their joie de vivre that I enjoyed. I wasn't brought up in a strict home, but it was fairly conservative home, freer than most, actually. But there was a spirit, and of course I took the kids to see the movies, particularly Diane. She was my youngest. The others could go off the movies on their own. So we saw Help 20 times and Hard Day's Night 20 times, and she dressed like Ringo. There was a scene with a lot of red in it, so she had to have red shoes and red socks and red shirt. And one day I came home and her ponytails were cut off, her pigtails, because she wanted to be like the Beatles. She had long, pretty hair, but she wanted to be like Ringo. And we lost a Ringo. She used to call him Yingo up at Saddle Mountain Ranch up here. And he was a little rubber Yingo that used to move around. And she lost him in a sandbox, and we had to go back and weeks later go through all the sand and find Ringo. And we had the music. We had the music of all those artists I mentioned, and went to see Bob Dylan up in San Jose. So personally, it made a big change in my life, in who I began to see, how I began to think, how I could feel or express myself through the music of the time. And along with the research that I was doing on the political assassinations, I had this other part of me that was interested always in the music of the times. And personally, it was really hard. It was hard to remember how much they touched me until this week, and these songs would come on, and each song would remind me personally of something I was doing at the time it came out. Let It Be was written May the 8th, 1970, on the birthday of one of my sons. I remember where I was when I heard Hey Jude. I was coming up, we were camping at Big Sur, and I was up near Rio Road up here in Carmel when I heard Hey Jude the first time. And I associate so many of their songs. I have a few favorites, but it was an era, and it didn't end. It was continuous. John, when he took his years out, was still, there was enough good stuff to listen to. He didn't have to keep pumping music while he was doing his thing. The real tragedy, one of the real tragedies, is that they didn't know the political animal. They were busy pulling back and retrenching and analyzing themselves, and as I say, not simultaneously knowing politics. In the new Playboy article that came out January 1981, the one that's on the stands now, Yoko and John have an interview, and Yoko Ono said, "The law is not a mystery to me anymore. Politicians are not a mystery to me. I'm not scared of all that establishment anymore." You wouldn't go in a nest of rattlesnakes and say that. You wouldn't go into a place where wild lions are. And just because John Mitchell went to jail and came out, he didn't soften his hatred of them or their potential, or Strom Thurmond or Richard Nixon or Kissinger or Brzezinski or the rednecks or the Jesus freaks who didn't like that saying. I knew immediately that this guy was influenced by that remark of Jesus. And sure enough, it turned out he carried that around with him. I was told, well, that was so long ago, you wouldn't kill Lennon for that. That's what somebody told me this week. I said, oh, no, you get somebody who makes a remark like that way back in the 60s or early 70s. This was in the 60s. And it would trigger a mind control program for somebody who wanted to get rid of them if they ever emerged. And emerging, they were. So this has been a very sad week. Yoko and John's innocence was to say the politicians are not a mystery. I'm not scared of the establishment anymore. And if there's one thing I leave with you this evening, is that as long as these killings are unsolved, the politicians are a mystery to you and me. As long as they get away with it, they are a mystery. You can't sit back and say a Beatles fan killed a Beatle. You can't say Lee Harvey Oswald wanted a place in history, so he killed John Kennedy. It wasn't that way at all. He was working with George de Mohrenschildt, a known war criminal, a Nazi during World War II. He had high contacts in the military establishment. These are not loners. They're well-financed, they're well-traveled, they're well-placed, and they know how to hurt us. And as long as their mentality exists, they'll continue to hurt us, and that is the tragedy. Well, I'm going to close this evening with a song I want them to play here from John Lennon's Merry Xmas, Merry Christmas, the war is over. And next week we'll do part 2 on the cold-blooded murder of John Lennon. Okay, now we'll get back to the bulk of the broadcast.